Hi, my name's Ken. This here's my talk. It's in 3 parts. These are basically the 3 parts. A bit of a forewarning, I wrote a much shorter version of this several months ago and was asked to do it here in an expanded version, and that expansion might get a little incoherent. So if this doesn't feel very unified, that's my fault. I'm sorry.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah, I know. Fill in all the blanks. Anyway, so the title is What Live-Action Role-Playing Games Do Well, because I'm not very good at coming up with titles for these things. But the 3 things we're doing is starting off with a high-altitude comparison between LARPs and other mediums. Fairly standard stuff. Then a short bit on, so what is it that actually makes LARPs good and work well, based on that comparison, more or less. And then a much longer 3rd section on designing and writing to those strengths. That's the basic idea. Let's see. Does this work? Need to click on it. Hello. There we go. Alright, now I can page down. So, first, what styles of LARP are we talking about? For the most part, theater-style LARP games. Varying size and length. At the very least, the kind where writers set up the characters and plots and have character sheets and that sort of thing. Though we have some application, I think this has some application to ongoing buffer and campaign LARPs where people invent their own characters. I might talk about that a bit in discussion. Most of my personal experience is with pseudo-competitive games with little NPC involvement, if not all PvP, which might actually be slightly unusual, but that's definitely where this is coming from. And I'm going to explicitly be avoiding Nordic style, very experimental forms, and non-entertainment variations like psychodrama and sociodrama. Psychodrama and sociodrama technically being forms of therapy, and I've definitely seen LARPs that go in that direction, if not all the way, because they're still trying to be entertainment. But basically working on the sorts of games that are trying to be fun, and that you spend a lot of time writing, rather than just watching. Disclaimer, very subject to my biases involving 2 game styles and play styles, and I want to be upfront about that. Hopefully it's applicable to many styles, but my tastes are definitely on display here. So if I say something that comes off as, wait, that sounds really wrong, I know. It's cool. We can talk about it. I just want to make sure that I'm not trying to tell people how to run their games if they do it differently. So let's get on to the meat. Part 1, comparison with other mediums. We basically have, in the phrase live-action role-playing game, the 3 parts. So I'm going to talk about the 3 parts, live-action, role-playing, and game. All 3 are important to define the medium, and if we're splitting hairs, the term LRPG might technically be more accurate than LARP. LARP is much more famous, it rolls off the tongue, it's much more marketable. I have no problem with it. I don't think that's very revelatory or anything. But it's an interesting little piece of distinction. If you go back, LARP is, I think, the term only dates back on 15 or so years when it was popularized. Before that, people were like, role-playing games, or live-action role-playing games, or real-time, interactive literature, real-time, real-space role-playing games, yada yada, all sorts of different stuff. So let's start in with live-action. Right, so obviously it's visceral and real, which is a thing that you don't get in very many other mediums. It's even better than like a movie or a video game because, well, you're actually living and breathing it. Somewhat comparable to improv or commedia dell'arte, if you know what that is. It's a traditional form of improv comedy plays, basically. Not necessarily comedy always. Also sometimes comparable to debate, sport, and other performance competitions, interestingly enough. People usually don't think of LARP as a sport, but the idea being that you have a bunch of people going out and doing stuff and interacting with each other in real time, sometimes competitively, and that's something that you can get with the live action aspects, more so than things that are not live action. For the role-playing, so you get to think and choose as a character, get inside their head, think, feel, and react as they do. And that's something that a lot of other mediums don't do. You don't see that in static things like movies and books very much. Comparable to tabletops, obviously, and method acting, interestingly enough. A lot of method actors do very similar mental exercises like that. Interesting enough, comparable to Choose Your Own Adventure books or even BioWare games, if we're into that, because, well, I'll talk about this in a moment, but basically the idea that you're making choices as the character and deciding what you do. We could talk about other video game RPGs. I don't actually think they usually compare. They're really more a game of you're strategically choosing how to build a character and then playing through a turn-based combat system to be rewarded by cutscenes. They're mostly called RPGs by tradition, but some of them get into this realm. And lastly, the game elements. A good game is designed to be exciting, or at least not boring. That's usually the point of game design. Engages competitive and exploratory impulses better than books or movies. Far better, usually, because you're actually interacting with it and there's some sort of basically choice and conflict going on. Some way to resolve things. And obviously comparable to the wide field of gaming, LARPing is usually much more organic than other forms. You would not mostly compare a LARP to Monopoly. Or, oh, you could.
Didn't some LARPs get Game Plus?
Yeah, oh, sure.
There's some ways that people play board games that are more LARP-like.
Absolutely. But at that point, they're more or less turning those into LARPs rather than turning LARPs into board games.
Yeah.
But that's a huge and wild field that we don't necessarily need to discuss in depth. So, to make this a bit more visceral, why is a book awesome? And I'm using examples here, and if I don't cover your favorite one, I'm sorry. I just pick some out of a hat. So in a book, right, you can experience a great depth of character, imagine their every experience, and get to have these epic visions that can never be realized outside the mind's eye. People will often talk about this book can never be filmed. That's usually because it's just you couldn't put it on a screen in a way that would satisfy people. And that is a cool thing that books can do that most other forms just can't. You also get to do things like be a part of a character's mind through all of their decision-making process at whatever pace you want throughout epically long periods of time. Why is a movie awesome? Well, you can experience grand audiovisual experience of giant robots smashing each other. Spectacular vision, seeing the actors' talents, and beautiful cinematography, tight editing, moving score, all come together to make a really beautiful whole. And, you know, there's no doubt that movies are a grand art form like that, and you can really get something out of them that you can't get in other places, especially if you go to the nice big screen, huge, loud audio, IMAX, blowing your ears out in 3D, the whole thing. Tabletop. You can build a character, overcome challenges, play out years, even decades of growth and accomplishment, all while spending time with your friends around a table. That's fairly unique. The way you can play with timescales, the way you can adapt the rules to work however you need on the fly, all sorts of cool stuff. And rolling dice, of course, is always fun. People like that. MMOs, just to use a video game example. Epic raids, collect epic loot, experience all the joys and pitfalls of teamwork. That's a fun one. All along with uniquely deep game mechanics, all in real time. You can do complex things in a software program that you simply cannot do at a tabletop, and the computer handles all the math for you, and that's really nice and does all the targeting, and you get to play out really interesting game designs. There's other. I like to sometimes talk about EVE Online, which is famous for having people spend 3 years infiltrating a corporation only to raid it, and other such things. But you can get a lot of different experiences. Obviously, there's other video games, but that's not necessarily what I'm going to talk about today. So finally, we get to why is a LARP awesome? And this is just my particular take on it. You can experience the visceral rush of actually being a character, acting and feeling and choosing as them, dealing with their accomplishments and their consequences, all while running around in costumes with people. There's a certain amount of satisfaction you get out of not just reading about it, and not just describing it, and not just playing it on a screen, but actually being able to do it for real, get the actual adrenaline rush, or the actual grief, or whatever your emotions are at that particular time. So part 2, what sets LARPs apart? We're going to talk about 2 things, in brief: emergent play, and immersion and immediacy. Things that make them really cool and set them apart from other mediums. So let's talk about emergent play first. This is a big one, in my opinion. Once players start playing games take on a life of their own, you may very many times have heard a GM say, well, we wrote this game and then the players rewrote it for us, or ran something that we didn't recognize. A game usually does not follow a script, because the players get their hands on it and do whatever they want. Choice and agency are sort of the key things here, or also phrased as free will and opposable thumbs. That's my way of, that's how I like to say it. The game becomes a microcosm of all these interdependent PCs bouncing off each other. Basically, you put a bunch of insects in a jar and you shook it. And it makes it unpredictable and organic rather than just a sequence of pre-generated content. This is, for example, why even the really best BioWare games can never really compare, because fundamentally somebody had to go and write those levels and render all those cutscenes, and now they're like, now we're not going to make 1,000 variations of each of them because that's too expensive. And if you're only going to ever see 2% of it, then you're not going to want to pay the money for that, and so on. Whereas in a LARP, most of it's going on in your head anyway, so it's very cheap, even with good production values. So, biased aphorisms. Just a couple things that I thought were witty and pithy to say and are clearly based on my biases. So here's a few of them, or this is the first one. Choice is the fundamental unit of role-playing. Think of that as what distinguishes it from acting. Right? Obviously, when you're role-playing, you're doing a lot of acting. You're saying, I want to do this thing, be this thing. But the fact that you're making choices as that character and not just following a script is what makes the difference. And that's not to say that acting is bad or anything, just when we want to draw the line between them. And we'll leverage off of this in a bit. So, immersion and immediacy, the second part. It's real time, so there's no dithering about your thought process. Potential to produce legitimately natural and instinctive reactions. You actually get scared by things, for example. So in a tabletop, you might have, your GM says, so you walk around a corner and there's a zombie, what do you do? And then you're like, okay, well obviously I'm scared and startled by that, but my character has a backstory that says he's seen a lot of zombies before, so not really, and do I draw my knife or do I draw my sword? Hold on, I need to roll dice to see how stunned I am. Whereas in a LARP, you actually walk around the corner and there's an actual zombie there. Well, a guy in makeup or something. And, well, do you flinch? Do you yell? Do you draw your weapon and fight? Are you fast enough? Those are all things that happen reactively. Not just in your head where you think them through, it's you actually have to do them. And that is something that's far more immediate than you get in an abstract role-playing sense. And more or less what makes them live. So, part 3, how to take advantage of these strengths. Talk about, we could try to split it up into these 4 parts. Maybe. We'll see how that works. Design plots to catalyze gameplay. That's a fun one. Leverage conflict and emergence. Also fun. Work with player psychology instead of against it. And keeping mechanics tight, which I'm sure is a discussion everyone will love. So let's jump in. Catalyzing gameplay. Right? So in static fiction, plot, the loosely term that we like to use, is the set of events that characters go through. But in LARPs, you don't really have scripts, so most people, when they say plot, they're more talking about a network of tension. What's your goals? The plot is what you're trying to do. Not that this is a good example in toto, but if you would imagine Raiders of the Lost Ark as a LARP, what is Indiana Jones's plot? Well, it's not, okay, find the Ark of the Covenant, get trapped in the Well of Souls, break out, blow up an airplane, get dragged behind a truck, recover the thing, get stuck in a submarine, all that kind of stuff. That's just a sequence of events that happen to him. In LARP terminology, his plot is, step 1, keep the Ark of the Covenant away from the damn Nazis. Step 2, try to get it in a museum. Step 3, rekindle your romance with Marion. And which of those you're prioritizing is sort of up to the player. And things like that. So usually when we create plot, we do it through creating motivations and goals, which in turn create tensions, conflict, and risk. Tension and conflict and risk create engaging play through choice, action, drama, and catharsis. We're getting into, I'm going to use the word system on a few occasions. You're creating a system of plots, whatever you want to call them, that will lead to many good stories emerging. Remember, emergence. And that system should feel rich, varied, and complex. Basically, plots exist to be fun, not to consume time. You're not writing out, this is what will happen. Yeah. Bias aphorism number 2. Plot is not how a character spends time in game. Plot is why a character spends time in game. When I first came up with that particular phrasing, or heard it, I don't know. I shouldn't take credit for it, probably. But I found that very revelatory, because I'm like, oh, I should stop trying to fill time, because that's annoying. And when you start filling time, then people are just grinding and doing busy work. Game design for fun and profit.
Wow.
So plots deserve just as much, and this is obviously my bias here, but deserve just as much, if not more, game design and theory attention as mechanics. I like to think of them as an elaborate economy of motivations and resources, including the knowledge economy and the trust economy and other cute metaphors you can come up with. And just so I'm clear here, this is not only useful for gamist playstyles, it's good drama thrives off it too. I'm not talking about gamist from the perspective of the player, I'm thinking from the perspective of the writer. Think of your game, we do use that word all the time, as a game, and you will make it better for everyone, even the people who really don't want to play games. Good design uses risk, reward, and other incentives to encourage non-boring behavior, and this is why it's cool. Progress requires interacting with other PCs, or taking chances, or doing something that's not sitting in a corner. I usually say look to designs that build off of social interaction and are asymmetric goals or rules. I like to use, oftentimes I'm like, how does this plot resemble a game of poker? Or a game of Mafia or Werewolf, if you're familiar with that. That's a very good example of asymmetric goals, by the way. Diplomacy, JFK and Henry Kissinger's favorite board game. Monopoly Rules is written, you know, the one where you actually use the auctions and the trading, and you don't give people all the lottery when they hit free parking.
Game that no one.
Yeah, the version of Monopoly that causes families to get in fistfights. Basically, these are all examples of games that are built around social interaction. Poker, it's a lot about bluffing and trying to read people. Mafia is basically trying to determine who you should be voting off the island at every turn. Sorry?
Who's lying?
Whose line is it anyway?
Who's lying?
Oh, who's lying, yes. And lying and catching lies and truth and all that kind of stuff, oh, damn it, is a big part of that. Diplomacy, because it's a war game that has no tactical rules. It's just all about convincing people to do stuff and lying to them. And Monopoly Rules is written, obviously, starts fights. The overall point here is that those sorts of activities, even if any given player is like trying to be isolated from it, some of them are like, yeah, I don't want the serious aspects of the game. The fact that you're in a giant environment that is built like one means that what you're doing is going to be more likely to be fun. Talk about statistics a bunch, basically. Re-click on the damn thing. Okay. Leading to this kind of qualifies as an aphorism. If choice is the fundamental unit of role-playing and game theory is the study of strategic decision-making, then it makes sense they go well together. Game theory being the study of strategic decision-making is like line 1 in the Wikipedia article on it. So if any of you are a game theorist, I apologize. But what you're really trying to do is make people's choices interesting. And choice is what they're primarily doing, or is what sets them apart from just acting. So that's the game. Leveraging conflict amongst the PCs. This is a fun one. So, not all conflict is PvP, but in my opinion, the healthiest conflict for the game usually is. Mostly because PvE and NPCs and all that sort of thing are not nearly so efficient at energizing a game or creating risk. I mean, you can, but you have to write all the damn puzzles, or create some damn maze, or cast a whole bunch of people as monsters and have them go pick fights. And then the monsters are all like angsting about what their burden of encounter is and whether they should be killing people and all that kind of stuff. And that all needs to be managed. Whereas if you just say, hey, PCs, you don't like each other, they don't angst about the burden of encounter. And anything with less agency than a PC is comparatively a boring adversary. You say, hey, you, to use the Raiders of the Lost Ark analogy, both Belloc and Indiana Jones should be PCs. Not one of them should be a damn foil. It's not professional wrestling with a heel turn or anything like that. Death. So obviously this comes up every time you talk about PvP, because people killing each other is a natural extension of it. So remember the free will and opposable thumbs bit, choice and agency? Well, that's what makes people dangerous, fundamentally. No matter what mechanics you give them, the fact that they are creative and can think of stuff is what makes them able to do shit that maybe you weren't expecting. Not all PvP is murder, obviously. However, willingness to die and willingness to kill are natural thresholds of motivations. I mean, you see it in fiction all the time. And when you talk about someone being willing to die for a cause, that means they're pretty serious. And it's hard to actually, like, yeah, it's possible to be even more dedicated than that, but it's not always psychologically applicable. Risk of loss is what makes success fun. Some people might disagree with that, but
Belief of the risk of loss.
hey, people are smart. They know when you're lying to them, as a designer. And obviously, risk of death is natural in crisis, and games, we're going to talk about this in a minute, games often involve crisis, and meshes well with the player's desire to continue playing, so the concept of bleed, this use of the term bleed is, like, accepted here, right? The notion of the real world seeping in. Basically, the player saying, I want to keep playing, is an interesting way to invest them in, I want my character to stay alive, so I'm not just using them like a rag doll. And it makes it more real. Slightly contentious sometimes, but go with it for now. Leveraging emergence. Here's a controversial thing to say. You are not telling a story when you're writing a game. Some people don't like saying that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. What you're doing is creating tension, conflict, and choices, and letting the stories tell themselves. Another way to phrase that is, you're not going to be able to predict what will happen. And if you've written a game where you can, you've probably written a game where nobody has any agency, because you've effectively forced them into a script. You don't control any single plot. You just try to get characters to interact. Again, the staking the jar metaphor is a fun one. Some plots fizzle, no matter how well you write them. Some choices end up being false choices by circumstance. Imagine you were writing a LARP that was set right before the Civil War, and you have Abraham Lincoln, and he's supposed to have this big choice of, do I go to war with the South or not? Not to whitewash over a bunch of history or anything. And yes, if you look at that from high altitude, that sounds like a very momentous choice. But it's entirely possible that in that LARP, that player would be like, at that particular moment, they just declared war on me. There's no real choice here. I have to fight or I die, or something to that effect. And you're like, well, that wasn't nearly as dramatic and awesome and momentum as I wanted it to be, for reasons you had no control over whatsoever. Also, sometimes characters die, or they punt, or they flake out, or they're too distracted by something else, and that beautiful plot you had set up just doesn't work out. So design ends up being a statistical problem. You want to put enough plot in the game and hope that even if some of it doesn't really work out so well, that something still happens. It's a dynamic sociology problem, basically, which means it's hard. Economists win Nobel Prizes for solving things like this, so don't think, oh, there's solid math here. But I do like to think of things as an economy of PCs rather than just a cast of characters. You think like a cast of characters, you're trying to determine how everybody fits in some particular story, and that usually doesn't work out so well in a game. Damn it, screensaver. Alright. Bringing us to biased aphorism number 4. If the best story a player has is a rehashing of something from their sheets, you have failed them. That's a somewhat aggressive way to say it, but basically, hopefully they have some story from the game that you didn't write. Also, that isn't just a recounting of this other guy telling them all about his backstory. But usually when I see a game when somebody says, what was so cool, and then they're just like, well, I was from this town, that was this character from this book, and all this cool stuff happened in the book, and I was that guy. Man, I got to be Han Solo, and what'd you do? Well, I played cards. That's usually not nearly as fun as them about telling you about the wacky thing you couldn't predict that happened to them. Player psychology. This is a hard one, because it's a little bit abstract. But, so, some background here. PC plots are often important and even epic, exciting and even urgent, and possibly nefarious. And the PCs tend to answer to each other for the most part. So you can have NPCs, but they're usually abstract. There's like a sign that says, yeah, there are cops here. Or there's a rule that says, yeah, you're not supposed to yell in the hallway because the NPCs will stop you, etc. Or they're part-time, like somebody's running around playing an NPC to push things around, but they're not there all the time. And the PCs are the guys with free will and agency. So the PCs are, generally speaking, only going to answer to each other. Given enough time, most games will resemble Lord of the Flies with a particular social morality. The reason for this is because that set of plots creates stress, creates crisis. It's kind of natural. If you've written a fun game, it's going to feel like a crisis to the characters at that given moment. And under stress, people get tunnel vision, and they stop thinking in terms of, man, I'm going to get arrested 2 days later. And the problem that comes up is trying to meddle with this to change their mind, as it were, causes cognitive dissonance. Artificial limitations are what irritate PCs. You can have a long-winded scenario that says, here's this very elaborate culture that explains why you would never, ever pick a fight with your brother. And you can have elaborate fictional morals that also explain the same thing. And they aren't going to be enough to actually alter the fact that a player at some point is going to want to fight their brother. And mostly because those things take a lot of time and emotional investment to internalize. You need significant bleed from real life to override the natural responses. I can use a more verbal example here. I NPC'd for a long game that was set in the Harry Potter universe. And they actually managed to convince a bunch of people to, rather than act like Lord of the Flies, to act like a bunch of boarding school students. And part of the reason was because they took advantage of the fact that the entire player base had spent literally half of their lives reading these books. And had internalized it. We also had a cast of like 20 NPCs playing teachers who would yell at them. And that was an awful lot of energy and an awful lot of work and an awful lot of background put in to just convince them to act like school children and not like normal people under stress. And even then, they still eventually got to murdering each other. Because they were put in a situation where they had these epic conflicts and plots that more or less called for it. So my advice here is work with it rather than trying to change it. And if you are trying to change it, realize that's a very big endeavor. I've also played several games that did it by basically saying you're all Catholic and the Pope is here, and playing off of very long-standing tropes of, yeah, in horror movies, Catholicism is real. And, the crucifix holds back the vampire. And enough time in childhood spent watching those movies meant people sort of had internalized that level of morality. And it was very basic. It wasn't, like, dogmatic or anything. So, design challenge. This is some Dogma 99 level bullshit. If you know what that is. That was one of the founding things of Nordic LARP. I think. I don't know. I don't know my history. Anyway, so I actually did manage to write a game, this is sort of post-hoc to it, that more or less fulfilled this. All things with agency are PCs, and all NPCs are represented as simply and unobtrusively as possible. So you're like, yeah, technically there's some cops here, but they're a sign, and we're not going to pretend that that sign is more meaningful than a sign. If it's not actively opposed by at least one other PC, it's not a plot. And so when you're like, man, I want to give every character at least 3 plots or something, that was what we were using as the judge. And if a PC is not willing to die or kill for it, it's not a major plot. We actually went so far for this game as putting on the application. A lot of times people ask, how hosed do you want to be, how busy? And we explicitly phrase that as, what percentage of your plots do you want to be willing to kill for? What percentage of your plots do you want to be willing to die for? And then explained, because this is what we see as the deciding factor. So obviously this is not like a rule. You don't always want to do this. We happened to do it. We were, I would say, 95% successful at fulfilling this. We had a couple NPCs. We had some GMs playing auctions, people leading auctions and stuff. And there was a little tiny bit of PvE in little parts of it. But for the most part, it worked. It produced a lot of fun. In combination with the mechanics, it also produced a 40% death rate, so keep an eye out for that. That said, that particular set of mechanics was fairly brutal. It was, you have a toy gun in your pocket, it has 20 shots, it's concealable, and it's fairly easy to kill 4 people if you have the drop on them. 5 if you're feeling ballsy.
And you're willing to die when it's over.
Well, yeah, that's the real risk of it is someone who's going to draw faster than me and shoot me first. But it was essentially the case of any time 2 people are off alone, if one of them is like, I'm going to kill that guy, and the other one doesn't realize it, that guy dies. And the only open question is whether or not somebody gets caught. But that's kind of a divergence from this. But this is an interesting design challenge just to think in terms of, I want to think of this as a bunch of PCs with agency who are not messing around with abstract limitations that aren't natural to them. Moving on to the last part, tight mechanics. What do I mean by tight? Well, I mean elegant and intuitive, which are bullshit words anyway. And that the players want to use them. They look at the mechanic that they see and they say, this will solve my problem. A pithy way to say this is if plots create tension and conflict, the mechanics resolve tensions and conflict, or at least good mechanics. If a mechanic is adding constraints, those constraints, like so, instead of you're an intercon, you can't run, I don't know, can you run in the hallways?
Briefly.
So, okay. I have been in intercons where they tried to tell us no running in the hallways.
Intercons where they say no LARPing in the hallways.
Yeah, we ignored them. They also said no toy guns, and we ignored that too. So maybe you have some sort of chase mechanic to allow you to have a chase scene through the hallway. And so that's adding constraints. You want those constraints to essentially be game-like, to create tensions and conflict or add risk and make choices more interesting, rather than just be a thing that someone could use if they really felt like it, but they don't care. And simplicity and restraint are your friends, restraint being the big thing. What this means is oftentimes you're going to come up with mechanics that sound really cool that no one will use, or no one will want to use, or people will feel annoyed at being forced to use. Incentives. This is getting into a bit deeper waters. So action in a game is generally open-ended, wherein the players will find creative ways around constraints. Social strategic elements, like who is helping who, tend to be the dominant factors. Plot usually dictates outcome more than mechanics. Think of it this way. You could write that race mechanic, and that's really cool, and you're like, yeah, we're going to have a race, and whoever wins gets the gold medal. And that's great, but being in a LARP, people with free will, someone's going to bribe one of the racers to throw the race, or they're going to shoot somebody, and otherwise the race mechanic's not really going to matter often, or some of the details aren't going to matter nearly as much as you were hoping. Mechanics can incentivize behavior and thus influence plot, but they can't script or control it. This all kind of ties back into what I was already saying, but I like to think of this as best if incentives feed back into the plot, not away. You want to monetize people and their help, not monetize time. An elaborate example of that, if you have a game where okay, so you want to invent the better mousetrap, which is a bad plot anyway, but you want to invent the better mousetrap, what does it require? Well, if I say this requires going off in a corner and solving puzzles, that's boring. I went off in a corner and I solved puzzles, it was a time waster, I used up time, and I built my better mousetrap, and at the end of the day said, well, what did I get out of that? And the answer is not much. And sure, you could paint that better mousetrap up as you were becoming a god and now you are a destroyer of worlds, at which point now you're just pissing off all the other players. Because some guy comes in and is like, I have solved all the puzzles and I am God and destroyer of the worlds, and everybody's like, who are you? The guy in the corner, didn't you see me? Whereas if you monetize people, say, for example, building the better mousetrap requires the help of people and 5 minutes of puzzle solving or something, or whatever you really want, and their help, rather than lots of arbitrary time, basically you get to feed back into plot and interactions and all those paranoias and choices and conflict, because you're like, well, who do I bring along to help me? Maybe they're those anti-mouse people, those pro-mouse PETA people who are going to kill me for building a mousetrap. I have to watch out for that, or pick your own elaborate example. Also, making something abstractly hard won't discourage it. It will incentivize brute force behavior and grumbling players. This is obviously more relevant to longer games. I've written a few that basically play out over the course of a week. You might have something like, oh, we're going to go explore the islands on our sailing ships because we're a pirate game. And it's a thing they do after hours or whatever. And you could say, well, okay, exploring an island takes an hour. You go out and sail. And that way, no one will explore all the islands because it takes an hour for each one, right? And next thing you know, someone is up until like 11 in the morning and like, I got them all! And you're like, Jesus Christ, man. And you're like, well, why'd you do that? That was supposed to be hard. And they're like, but my plot said I had to. Because I'm trying to find the treasure and you didn't tell me which island it was on. But I found it. And that's a fairly good example of the reason the player did something that was fundamentally stupid and painful is not because the player is stupid and a masochist. It's because you incentivize them to do something stupid and painful. Much better to say, how about you can only explore 2 islands a day, or some other thing. Who is calling me? Not now. So, speaking to the last part, indulgences. Sometimes you do have a specific story to tell. I said you're not telling a story, but sometimes you are. Usually as a backdrop. Sometimes you have a mechanic for its own sake. You're like, man, I really want this war game in this game, even though I don't really need it. You want a trope to play out for artistic reasons. Sometimes an idea is too funny to pass up. I have, in fact, written games that are entirely designed around emulating Final Fantasy RPGs with grinding mechanics, because it's a tongue-in-cheek and it's fun, and it was a nice little diversion. They can add expressive depth and moderation, stuff like that. The point here being that, much like with grammar, people will say, look, if you know the rules well enough, you're allowed to break them. You're allowed to do things that sometimes might not make the game more a game. It's just make sure you understand when you are. I think, yes, that is the end. So now I suppose we can open up to questions, discussion, etc.
I have one question. Can we get copies of your notes and presentation?
Yeah, it's a PDF file. I don't know what the best way to do that is, but I will email it to Cameron, I suppose. I also believe this is videotapes.
To put this up, so send it to Cam and it can go up.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah, hopefully it'll integrate.
Absolutely. I might spell check it first or something, but I think it's good. So yeah, questions.
Maybe a different color.
Uh,
Why did you choose this color?
Can I get that icon in cornflower blue? All right. I didn't use my pointer. I'm so sad. So questions.
So I've heard the definition of a game as a series of interesting choices.
That is certainly some people's definition of a game.
So I guess what I'm saying is your way of distinguishing role playing from theater is very much like the definition of game from.
It is.
So it was just
To some extent, I feel that's the reason why role-playing almost always goes with the word game.
Yeah, you don't hear them separately.
Exactly, because, I mean, you do sometimes, like, I pretended to be a patient with certain symptoms for some med students once. That is technically role-playing, without a game. You're just like, yeah, you're giving them practice at their bedside manner. Obviously, people do stuff for therapy and all sorts of fun things. Sorry?
I've run LARPs for kids who have ADHD before, and that's the same similar situation.
Right. Now, I mean, that was sort of the point about them going well together, the game theory and role-playing. There we go. Basically, I don't know if that's coincidence or not. I mean, I've never actually heard very many people describe or define role-playing as making choices. It's just the thing that intuitively to me makes sense. What is it? How is this different from acting, or even improv acting? Obviously, when you're doing improv, like proper improv, you are making choices, but those choices are not, this is my character deciding what to do. This is my actor, me, deciding what can I do to keep this improv going.
Well, actually, sometimes that's the right decision in a role-playing game, too. What is the right decision for my character to do to make this game run better for everyone, including me?
Sometimes that is. I would not describe that particular action as role-playing. That's more of a metagaming thing, which is not always bad. I don't mean to say that's bad. I usually say that the more people have to do that, the more you're dragging them out of the game, which is why I usually... that was part of the impetus for the Dogma 99 level bullshit, was try to write a game where people have a minimum amount of worrying about, wait, how do I step back? What's best for everyone? It's like, no, this is actually designed to work best if you are thinking what makes sense for you. Other questions?
I disagree with that. I think that part of the idea of if making choices is part of the game, and that's what we're exercising our ability to make choices, then making the choice that is best for everyone can be within or without character in any situation. So.
Oh, it's definitely part of the game. I'm not saying it's not part of the game. I'm just saying that I would not. That particular thought process, I don't call that role playing. I call that more.
There's also one other aspect, right? Suppose I'm trying to reproduce a particular, I'm the mustache twirling villain. Part of my arc, and I want it, is to get caught and go down in flames, make a big speech, and then be dragged off to prison. So I'm going to make decisions as a player that are inherently bad for my character because I want that role to play out.
Well, that's still a form of sort of a meta goal, I guess. It's possible that for the character, in their mindset, what you're doing makes sense. It makes sense that I'm doing the stupid thing and tying the guy up rather than just killing him because of my particular psychoses or whatever. And you could have it. I don't mean to say that always doing that is bad for the character or anything like that. Just when you're thinking in terms of this is a medium and I'm trying to have the specific goal that is not necessarily like the thought my character is having, then not to say that it's bad, but I would not personally qualify that as role playing properly.
I mean, you said at the beginning that you were talking about a specific type of LARP.
Yes.
And notably not the sort of what I think of as Nordic style ones that are more about having an emotional experience. But
we could absolutely have a very giant playing to win versus playing to lose conversation. It would be pointless and unanswerable.
I disagree with pointless, but I do agree with the unanswerable.
I think it would be pointless to try to have it here, I guess is what I mean.
Tangent.
I don't think we'd get anything out of it. Actually, at last NELCO, Cameron did his filming, answering questions of people. One of the questions was is it art or is it a game? And usually that question is getting into sort of an argument of form versus function. And in my opinion, game design is a lot like architecture. Form versus function are both part, and is in fact a classic philosophical argument that no one has ever answered for centuries. So, and I think a similar, am I playing to express a particular concept, or am I playing to win, or am I playing to be honest to the character, or am I just playing to give myself the maximal excuses to be loud and sing? Whatever your bag is, really. That's a long-standing debate that no one's ever really going to be able to solve, because it comes down to personal choice.
I'll argue it's actually a game design issue. If I'm doing a set of musical LARPs, then then part of the overarching design is certain things, and that winning for a character in that game is I get to do as many big dramatic moments as are appropriate as I can reasonably get away with without stepping on everyone else.
Oh, absolutely. I'm more thinking in terms of you wrote a non-musical LARP, but you have a musical theater person who likes to find excuses to sing all the time. That's like a drive, and I've seen that. I've seen people, no matter what character they're playing, they're trying to be a stand-up comedian because they're good at it. And sometimes that's just a goal that players come in with. It's a style of theirs.
Well, I agree, and that's a challenge in the casting questionnaire. But if I'm putting on my game designer hat, my goal is to find that this is a square-shaped peg, and see, is there a square hole in the game, or can I add one conveniently without interfering with the rest of the delicate balance? And if so, drop them in it, and if not, say, hey, watch out.
I mean, usually if I have not written just to use the singing example in particular, if I have not written a game designed to be musical, I probably don't ask that question even, because why would it occur to me? But
it's because that guy who signed up for your game is the one who always sings.
yeah, that's a rare enough occurrence in my particular case, but we're getting sidetracked here. Other questions? Or whatevers.
You compared LARPs to MMOs and had mentioned also EVE Online, which is a little bit different from other MMOs in that it's one big world with literally tens of thousands of people in it. Did you have any thoughts on comparing LARPs to virtual worlds?
Second Life, that kind of thing. I for time, I didn't want to get into many different things. I do find that, so EVE Online is interesting because it's actually, I've never played it, I've just read a bunch about it. I know people who have played it. I actually avoid MMOs like the plague. They're too addictive. But EVE Online is famous for being the sort of thing that people lose real money on, and people take very seriously. It's also somewhat famous for more or less being an interactive spreadsheet, at least when the fights happen. But it's cool and interesting to me because it is a sort of place where the wars don't, a war happens not because some guy wrote, "We're in a war now." It's because two factions of players decided to start shooting at each other over something they cared about a whole bunch, probably.
And that's pretty awesome.
And the fact that happened is that's unprecedented in many other mediums. You can't. It's actually hard to do that in a LARP without setup, because LARPs just don't go on that long and they don't involve enough people.
Well, and a lot of times the writers will go, I'm sorry, we can't do that.
Yeah. So to mention the Lord of the Flies thing about player psychology, so I'm for the most part I'm not talking about ongoing campaign and buffer LARPs. I think some of this applies to them, but they have the obvious problem that usually the writers don't get to set people's motivations. And players setting their own motivations, especially in games like that, tend to default more towards we are an insulated, tight-knit village of people who all like each other and are very much hate outsiders, because that's just a very natural thing, because the outsiders are those damn NPCs who keep coming in to cause trouble.
And every time an NPC comes, they bring trouble.
And it turns out, psychologically speaking, when you have a tight-knit village, you're never going to get a war. Because it's 30 people, or 50 people. And 25 of them are going to say, we're going to war with the other 25? It's fairly rare. You get more popularity contests, you can get all sorts of politics, but proper scaled war, unlikely. obviously, the longer the game goes, the more time people have to be invested, the more developed the economy is. All those sorts of questions make it happen, I think. I don't know about Second Life. Second Life obviously is more of a... It's almost like it's like high-res Minecraft, right?
Or the other way around.
Or Minecraft. Well, Minecraft hardcore mode is like Second Life in low res. It's fairly go in and create stuff. So I don't know how well that compares to LARP. It's a thoroughly different medium. Obviously, it doesn't have game elements.
A medium that you can use to create something that is LARP-like.
Yeah, sometimes. I usually, if you were going to say we're doing a LARP inside Second Life, that means you're still going to have a GM somewhere writing plots for those characters, and just having them play it out in the computer rather than in real space.
Right.
Which
there are large communities that evolve in virtual, especially Second Life, that have gone on for years. And I mean, Second Life has been around, because technically since 2004, it got big in 2006. It's been going on 8 years, and there are people who have known each other pretty much this whole time and form these communities and spontaneously have events, and there's all sorts of offshoots of role playing, and the fact that it happens over the span of years rather than hours or days is...
I mean, you can get similar stuff in old school forum role playing or forum communities, BBN type stuff going way back. I guess Second Life is cool because people do the whole avatars and they're living out their 90s virtual reality dreams, because that was the vision of the future in the 90s. So I did not particularly focus on it, just because it felt, I mean, there's thousands of mediums, right? How do LARPs compare to painting? I don't know. Not well is actually my answer, but you never know. Anything else?
What would you consider your most successful game that you've written? And why?
Hard questions. I've written a lot. Most successful in which terms?
Specifically relating to what you've just been talking about.
Okay. Because there's some games that I wrote that I felt were very successful artistically, but might not necessarily have been as fun or as engaging for everyone as you wanted, or as I wanted. But I will do the optimistic thing and say the one that actually this came out of. I will point out that we did not. That this was a 10-day long game run about a year ago. It was a spy game set in Mogadishu in the near future. It was very, very deadly, very bloody. We were advertising this sort of a Casino Royale sort of thing. It was a gritty reboot of the spy genre. And these came out in the writing, and we weren't necessarily thinking them as, we need to stick to this. It just sort of happened. But in the end, it was the largest game I ever wrote. It was about 65 players. And in terms of the longer, that 10-day format games that I have written, it was certainly the one that seemed to engage the most of them over the largest amount of time. And it got the least amount of complaints. I mean, you can only please about 80% of the people, and there's going to be 20 people who are grumbling, some of them, but in this case, most of them were dead early on. And they were grumbling because they were like, God damn it, that asshole shot me and I didn't see it coming. And we're like, not that I actually consider this to be something you really want to strive for, but I do find it better if a plot decays into chaos rather than into boredom. And, well, how did that plot resolve? Well, somebody got trigger happy and, all the scientists building the better mousetrap wandered into a room with a secret cabal of vampires and got eaten. That was probably more fun than they all got bored and went home. But, so by those metrics, I would say that would be my most successful one. But it was also my most recent one of note. So maybe I'm biased there and just thinking in terms of most recent stuff. Yeah, I'm constantly improving, right? I haven't peaked. So yeah, that's a kind of cheap answer, but meh. Like I said, there were NPCs there. We sometimes felt bad about that. But mostly it was all the GMs at one point ran an auction when I was a guy And
if
that was easier to do than
if you become a slave to your own dogma, then it becomes as big a problem as not following.
Oh yeah, well, so this says, as simply and unobtrusively as possible. It turns out there wasn't a more simple or unobtrusive way to run an auction that's not run by PCs, rather than just having a damn GM run an auction. And it was the case that if someone had shot the auctioneer would have died. No one ever did so, but because we glared at them. But
And you had the GM thing floating over your head.
no, we were armed. And we actually did pre-plan this. If someone shot an auctioneer, the next auctioneer would come with a bulletproof vest, which wouldn't make much of a difference, but
That's something.
it would set a sign, stop shooting at us, please, we're here to do a job. So I don't know if that really answers your question. I hope it does, but anything else?
Auctions are an interesting thing for a mechanics conversation, because it's very hard to empower a player and motivate them to have an auction rather than, okay, I'll sell this to you and that to you, and do a little dance, and we're done.
I mean, it sometimes makes sense when you're like, I know there's a bunch of you all want this, and I want to make you compete, and I don't want to sit here and do 10 hours of haggling with people individually over it. An auction is a way to do it.
Yeah.
And the problem is, if it's a GM-driven auction of like, we want to put these items in the game, the auctioneer has the power to be like, I'll give it to you for $5, I don't care. Because, again, someone's going to bribe your runners. Someone's going to tell your boxer to throw the match, and so on, because there's just all sorts of motivations that override the mechanic. The nice thing about auctions are they aren't really a mechanic. Or, I mean, the mechanic is roughly, at what point does the item card exist? Who hands the money to who? But the actual auction itself is played out as people understand auctions. Anything else? Ron, somebody wants to pick a fight. You know it. Alternatively, it's like 12-12, so.
Well, anytime is fine. I have a question about auctions. I don't want to derail us, but
We're into the rail, so.
Yeah, that's good.
So, the value of money is a tricky thing to get right in a game, right?
The value of money is a tricky thing to get right in the real world.
Well, I've already mastered that, so I'm not.
Economics and games is hard.
There's Bitcoin, right? There's a new one, I forget what it's called, but it's based on reputation. People may create currency of their own, and it is labeled with the person who created it, and so its value will be based on how much you care about that person.
I've read that Cory Doctorow book.
Yeah, well, someone was saying that, like, if Bitcoin is the Fisher-Price version of the currency of the future, they wanted the art project version of the currency of the future. Anyway, sorry to distract you.
Just like you're running an auction, how much people are willing to compete? Like, on your slide it says if PC's not willing to die for it, it's not a major plot. You only presumably have one life to give, and therefore that has an inherent value to that character. But money, they're like, well, if I live out the rest of my life as a, or a hermit because of the amount of money I paid for this thing at this auction, like that may not have a big impact on the player, even if it would on the character. So I always find it difficult, and I'm just wondering if you have any insights into that.
For that particular game, we treated money like any other resources. The points of money were not unlike points of the biology skill. It was we created sources, as in people had a finite amount of it, and then maybe some income, and we created sinks, and so you need money. And the auctions were, since they were run by GMs, this is entirely a sink. This is in fact the primary thing most of you are stockpiling money for. So it comes down to who has more of it. The intrinsic value of any particular piece wasn't very much, because we weren't like making people buy their meals in game or anything like that. It was the case that most of the stuff they were bidding on were stuff that they were willing to murder over. That was in fact the point. It was a plot where it was like, do you want to tell the world, or at least all the people assembled in this room, that you're one of the people after that briefcase? Because all the other people after that briefcase, maybe they'll let you win that auction, and then hunt you down later.
You have more money than me, but I have more bullets than you.
And your counteraction there is, I will buy the bullet. I will buy the briefcase, run off with my bodyguards, and hide it somewhere so nobody knows where it is. So if you kill me, you lose it. And then that happened, and someone killed them anyway because they were dumb. And then no more briefcase. So there are failure modes here. But everything, like, it was just another way. We wanted another form of social interaction. And so we invented the value of money in that case. It's not like we just said, here's money, pretend it's useful. Because that Money is only useful as what it can buy. And unfortunately, characters in that sort of game aren't thinking in terms of long-term security, quite naturally, because they're like being told the future of your country is at stake. If you don't do this, then the terrorists win, or whatever, because it was that sort of game. So people didn't really care about their, oh, how happy will I be in my post-life, because their post-life was on another continent, and this is a cover identity, and mostly what they're here to do is do a bunch of high-stress decision-making. But money's hard. Money's always hard, and you can't just add money and create an economy. Money has to be a thing that is traded and valued. And in a LARP, it being, I guess, a closed enough system, the money has to be like it's basically a barter economy. Money is just a thing you barter with, I guess. Anybody else?
Again, that tends to.
You go first. He can remember his thing.
I was saying that tends to spark the question of the fundamental PC motivation issue. That is the challenge of what Tuesday goals, what in-game activity can you motivate people with, other than the fun of actually playing the game. We like doing this, or we wouldn't have signed up to do it. Which makes death particularly bad in that context, because it means I get to stop doing the one thing I definitely signed up to do. And in exchange for the risk of dying, I may achieve a Tuesday goal and get bragging rights that I won.
Well, I mean, in theory, the point of the risk of death is to say, so you want to play a brave and courageous character who does dare. You want to play James Bond, right? And some people look at, well, what's cool about James Bond? The cool thing is James Bond always wins. The problem is if you give James Bond the ability card, you always win, that character's boring as hell. What you want is, you might die, and what's cool about James Bond is, despite that fact, he still goes and tries. He's still doing this daring do, and that's how you're emulating that feeling. Now, it depends on, obviously, some games you're not trying to go after the feeling of being death-defying, in which case you don't necessarily care about the risk of death. That really is a genre question to some extent. I do think that there's a lot of different motivations. I've heard commonly, or I don't know, not so commonly, heard it split into four. There's people who want to act, there's people who want to roleplay, there's people who want to achieve things, there's people who want to explore. That's one way. Or you can also have the gamist, narrativist, simulationist thing. That's usually more of a game-wide concept rather than an individual player decision. But in my opinion, this may be controversial, all of those are served by characters having the freedom to maybe do stuff like kill each other. Not because you're trying to encourage them to kill each other, but because the world is more rich and feels more real and you're more invested in it. Part of what I was talking about with the bleed thing about mapping the risk of death with the risk of not being able to play anymore actually makes the risk of death something you take seriously. Rather than, and which in turn it means your motivations of do this, in fact you're willing to die to do this, all of a sudden that motivation you're taking more seriously, you're more invested in the character, and you're more invested in what they're thinking. Now, that doesn't work for everybody. I'm not trying to say it does. That's just been my experience of that sort of thing.
But there's the implicit casting challenge of getting people who are willing to die and give up the fun.
Oh, absolutely.
For the goal that you were told this is what
truth in advertising is a big part of that.
Yeah.
Sometimes you want to write a game where that will never happen, and I've done that myself. It's thoroughly normal. No, what was your...
So on the death topic, isn't having a game where death isn't just, in the general overall rules, but something that you're striving to, have death, and again...
That game I talked about, we aimed for a high death count.
No.
We advertised the game as guns will definitely kill you, because there have been a bunch of games where they hadn't. But sorry, keep going.
But, doesn't that essentially choose the game as in action genre?
Oh, absolutely.
So I would say then, if this is a key point to your design, your whole design methodology is about action genre gaming.
So the death question, which is really just one. Where is it? There we go. Really, just one slide is that. Remember how I said at the beginning this is not exactly unified? This is a slide I added later of this is worth discussing. It is the key point I would say that is more universally applicable outside of other genres is the notion that People are dangerous.
Right.
The free roll opposable thumbs emergence.
People are going to work against your goals.
Yeah, people are going to work against they're going to work against each other's goals, they're going to work against my goals. Usually I don't like to think of it as my goals anyway, as a writer, because I'm handing the game to the players and seeing what they do with it to some extent. This is just more a matter of recognizing that sometimes if you give people epic enough stuff that they care about, they're going to naturally decide the best and most efficient way to deal with this problem is to eliminate my opposition. And saying, well, this isn't that sort of game. It's like, well, that's to some extent their choice if it's that sort of game. Now, obviously, I might write that sort of game and explicitly advertise for it, or I might write a different sort of game and make killing very hard. That game I was talking about, killing was very easy. I've also written games and played games where killing involved like an hour of planning, and it was actually any time you started a fight with someone, it was likely to go on for 10 minutes, and everybody crowds around you and stuff. And that slows it down. I don't know if this is necessarily so. I don't think the whole thing applies to just the action genre. I do think it might apply to the exciting genre, but that's because that's my bias there. I think games should be exciting, but exciting means a lot of different things to different.
Bias on,
Yeah.
exactly.
Some people are very excited by emotional catharsis, and that's cool. Even in games that are high death, I tend not to kill people because I'm more excited by the character interactions and the relationships. That said, I want those to feel authentic, and they're not authentic if I'm not scared. If it's not possible for me to be scared of things.